economy is expected to expand 2.5% this year.
Boosting Korea's ties with its global partners on the sidelines of the Status UN summit.
A massive drone attack on Ukraine overnight on Monday and Tuesday.
Arirang.
The ruling Democratic Party emerged as the clear winner in Korea's June 3rd local elections, claiming victory in 12 of 16 mayoral and gubernatorial races nationwide. But in the race that drew the most attention, incumbent Seoul Mayor Oh Se-hoon of the People Power Party successfully defended his seat, giving the opposition a crucial win in the capital. In the parliamentary by-elections, the Democratic Party won 9 of 14 seats, while the People Power Party secured 3 victories in the Yeongnam region. Independent candidate Han Dong-un also claimed a closely watched win in Busan's Book A district. As the Lee Jae-myung administration marks its first year in office, we look back at the key outcomes of President Lee's pragmatic diplomacy and economic policies and assess their impact at home and abroad. Korea's local elections and parliamentary by-elections have delivered a mixed but politically significant result. The ruling Democratic Party expanded its influence across much of the country, while the conservative opposition managed to hold on to some key battlegrounds. For a closer look at what the results mean for Korean politics, our correspondent Moon Hae-ryun joins us in the studio. Welcome back, Hae-ryun.
Thanks for having me, Tammy.
Hae-ryun, let's begin with the local elections. What stands out most from the results? So let's start with that.
So the headline is that the DP has managed to consolidate its political dominance. The party won 12 of 16 gubernatorial and mayoral races, giving it control of most regional governments and extending its influence beyond the presidency and the National Assembly. But the story is more nuanced than a simple landslide. The most closely watched contest was the Seoul mayoral race, where conservative incumbent Oh Se-hoon narrowly held on despite a strong challenge from the DP.
Voters have reaffirmed the principle of checks and balances, safeguarding Seoul's democracy.
I humbly accept the voters' verdict. I fell short, and I take full responsibility.
That result denied the ruling party a complete sweep of the capital region and gives conservatives an important political foothold heading into the second year of President Lee Jae-myung's term. Elsewhere, however, the DP performed strongly. It retained Gyeonggi-do province and Incheon while also capturing Busan, a city that has traditionally been regarded as conservative territory. Even in Daegu, one of the country's most reliably conservative regions, the race was far more competitive than many had expected. Many analysts see the results as a sign that voters remain broadly supportive of President Lee's administration 1 year after he took office.
And furthermore, I think it shows that a major proportion of the citizenry is actually in support of President Lee's administration and has strong faith in his good performance throughout the remaining years of his presidency.
And Hae-ryun, at the same time, voters elected new lawmakers in a series of parliamentary by-elections. What stood out from those elections?
So several of these contests actually carried a significance far beyond the constituencies themselves. And the biggest spotlight was on Busan's Book A district, where former PPP leader Han Dong-un won as an independent candidate after breaking with his party. His victory keeps him at the center of national politics and could make him a major player in any future reorganization of the conservative camp. Another closely watched race was Incheon's Gyeongbi district, formerly represented by President Lee before he moved to the Blue House. The DP comfortably held the seat, reinforcing its strength in what has long been considered one of its strongholds. But perhaps the most dramatic result came in Pyeongtaek-B, where veteran conservative lawmaker Yoo Hee-dong defeated 4 other candidates, including not only the DP candidate but also Cho Guk, leader of the smaller progressive Rebuilding Korea Party. Cho's defeat is particularly significant because it weakens his party at a time when merger discussions with the DP have been widely discussed. Overall, the ruling party won 9 of the 14 parliamentary seats at stake, preserving its overwhelming advantage in the National Assembly.
Indeed. Hae-ryun, let us wrap up with this ultimate question. What impact could these results have on Korean politics going forward?
So the immediate fallout is most likely to be felt very strongly inside the conservative opposition. Right. And although the PPP managed to defend Seoul and gain several parliamentary seats, its poor performance nationwide is expected to trigger renewed debate over the party's direction and leadership. Han Dong-un's return to parliament could further intensify those discussions, particularly among conservatives who argue the party needs to appeal more effectively to moderate and metropolitan voters. On the ruling side, attention is turning to the future of the Rebuilding Korea Party, with Cho Guk saying that he will step down from his post as its leader. His defeat may complicate merger talks with the DP, at least in the short term, although pressure for broader progressive unity could re-emerge before the next general election in 2028. In the National Assembly, however, the overall balance of power remains largely unchanged. Together with allied parties, the DP still controls more than 180 seats, enough to fast-track legislation and overcome filibusters. At the same time, the opposition retains enough seats to block constitutional amendments, ensuring that confrontation between the two sides is likely to continue. So while these elections strengthened the ruling party, they also set the stage for an intense battle over the future direction of both the government and the conservative opposition.
Well, a lot to keep track of in the days ahead. Hae-ryun, thank you for the coverage.
Thank you for having me.
And the local elections and by-elections witnessed a remarkable voter turnout this year, while there was a halt in voting at some polling stations here in Seoul amid a shortage of ballot papers. Park Jun-han has the details.
Following record-high early voting turnout last week, over 27.2 million people cast their ballots in Korea's June 3rd local elections, out of approximately 44.6 million eligible voters. That brings the final voter turnout to 61%. Not only is this a 10.1 percentage point jump from the previous local elections 4 years ago, but it's also the highest turnout since the first local elections in 1995, which saw 68.4%. Progressive voters were strongly mobilized following the then-President Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law and impeachment, while conservative voters cast their ballots to evaluate the current Lee Jae-myung administration and keep the majority party in check. By region, Jeonnam Gwangju United Special City saw the highest turnout at 65.7%, followed closely by Gangwon-do Province at 64.5% and Gyeongsang-namdo Province at 64.4%. The capital Seoul was above the national average at 63.6%. However, there were issues at 14 polling stations in Seoul, including in the Songpa-gu and Gangnam-do districts, where voting was paused due to a lack of ballot papers. At least one station in Songpa-gu district remained open until 10 p.m. as officials worked to address the problem. The National Election Commission's Secretary General Ho Chol-hoon issued a public apology for the confusion and pledged measures to prevent a recurrence. In response to the issue, the Blue House urged the National Election Commission, as the constitutional body responsible for protecting citizens' voting rights, to ensure there are no disruptions to voting or vote counting in affected areas. The Blue House added that it is closely monitoring the situation. Park Jun-han, Arirang News.
Now, following the elections, President Lee Jae-myung vowed to humbly accept the will of the people and do his best to improve their livelihoods in the year ahead. Yoon Jung-min has more.
The day after the June 3rd local elections, the president said this.
정부도 지방선거에 담긴 우리 국민들의 뜻을 겸허하게 받들어 소속 정당 여부와 관계없이 새로 선출된 지방정부와 적극적으로 협력하겠습니다.
Appearing in a three-colored tie representing unity, President Lee Jae-myung asked politicians to work together for the livelihoods of the people and national unity. The ruling Democratic Party won most races but lost the Seoul mayoral contest by a razor-thin margin in a seat often deemed crucial in South Korean politics. President Lee, who's now in his second year in office, once again vowed to do his utmost to make progress in improving the people's livelihoods and the development of the country.
오늘부터 국민주권 정부의 2년차 임기가 시작됐습니다. 모든 공직자들은 신발끈을 다시 한번 단단히 묶고 국정 속도 배가에 총력을 기울여 주기 바랍니다.
Regarding incidents where certain districts in the capital ran short of ballot papers, the president called for the need to hold those responsible to account after analyzing what went wrong using all administrative authority.
민주공화국에서 무엇보다 철저해야 될 선거 관리에 납득하기 쉽지 않은 허점이 발생한 점에 대해 매우 큰 유감을 표합니다.
His spokesperson added that the president did not mean direct punishment of the National Election Commission. The president went on to call for prevention measures to make sure that not an inch of the people's suffrage has been damaged. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
One year after President Lee Jae-myung took office, promising a pragmatic approach to foreign affairs, South Korea is attracting growing attention as a middle power partner in an increasingly fragmented global landscape. To assess the impact of that strategy, our Oh Soo-young spoke with a leading scholar of Korean geopolitics.
1 year into President Lee Jae-myung's pragmatic diplomacy, there is growing demand for Korea's partnership in an increasingly divided world. That's according to Arnold Levaux, president of Paris-based Asia Center. Under the Lee administration, pragmatic diplomacy has meant pursuing national interests through practical cooperation while broadening Korea's diplomatic options in an increasingly fragmented world.
The key word is adaptation. President Lee inherited a very difficult international environment. The rivalry between the United States and China continues to intensify. Conflict in Europe, like in Ukraine and in the Middle East, Iran, and the Red Sea are affecting global stability.
Over the past year, Seoul has kept close coordination with Washington and Tokyo while expanding engagement with Europe, India, Africa, and other emerging partners. Levaux says that makes Korea valuable to countries looking for more flexible forms of cooperation.
Middle powers do not want to be forced into binary choices. They want to maintain strong alliances while preserving enough autonomy to defend their own interest. The second challenge is economic security. For decades, globalization was mostly about efficiency. Today, it's also about resilience. Many countries today are looking for alternatives to rigid bloc politics. They want flexible partnerships, focus on practical cooperation. And Korea is particularly well positioned to play this role.
President Lee made his diplomatic debut at last year's Group of Seven summit in Canada soon after taking office, and has also been invited this year to the leaders' meeting in France. With that, Levaux says Korea will be expected to bring more than symbolic participation.
This invitation is not only for protocol, it's not for pictures, it's not for etiquette. It's because we believe that Korea can really contribute to the global governance. And we are expecting President Lee to have some concrete proposals. Korea is increasingly present in international debates on security, technology, and governance. I will say that the world already sees Korea as a global actor, while maybe Korea do not perceive itself as a global actor yet. So the question should be how Korea can use this growing influence.
As Lee enters his second year in office, Levaux says the question is no longer only whether Korea has a seat at the table of global governance, but what it makes of it. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
As today marks the first anniversary of the Lee administration, over the past 12 months, the primary focus has been the economy, marked by a push for an AI-driven tech boom and aggressive fiscal policies. Our business correspondent Kim Do-yeon joins us in the studio to break down the administration's economic scorecard. Welcome back, Do-yeon.
Good to be here.
Do-yeon, the most visible achievement highlighted today is the historic surge of the country's benchmark, KOSPI. Tell us more.
Right. So President Lee's focus on the market was clear from day one, choosing the Korea exchange for his very first outside schedule. The outcome of that directive is a vertical climb for the KOSPI. First, take a listen to what he said.
대한민국 주식시장은 여러분들 아시는 것처럼 너무 불공정하고 불투명하고 다른 나라 사람들이 보면 저 시장을 어떻게 믿냐 이렇게 생각될 정도 아닙니까?
First, he started off with cracking down on any financial crimes or market manipulations. The government warned that things will get tougher, and it started taking off, driven largely by the AI boom and its demand for memory chips. Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix drove the KOSPI up. When the administration assumed office last June, the index stood at the 2,700 level. It is now trading above the 8,500 mark. The government actively engineered this momentum by pivoting toward an ultra-innovation economy. They allocated 10.1 trillion won to build sovereign AI infrastructure, which includes securing 260,000 NVIDIA GPUs to establish the computational foundation for domestic high-tech manufacturing.
Well, this high-tech export boom clearly impacted the broader macroeconomic indicators. But I must say, Do-yeon, the global situation wasn't all that favorable to the administration, right?
That's right. But the unprecedented rise in exports provided the necessary capital to fund massive fiscal interventions. Following the economic contraction from the December 3rd martial law incident, the government passed a 31.8 trillion won supplementary budget to inject liquidity into the market. When the Middle East war erupted in February, they executed another 26.2 trillion won war supplementary budget to cap oil prices.
These policies were clearly deployed to boost domestic demand, and they have been effective in increasing consumption. Such fiscal maneuvering is necessary when there is budgetary room, and right now we are seeing strong tax revenues backing these measures.
Well, the trade fronts are also successfully negotiated down U.S. tariffs from 25% to 15%. And with all this, the Bank of Korea announced that the nation's first quarter economic growth surged to 3.6% on-year basis, with exports hitting a record $219.9 billion.
Well, with the technology and export sectors breaking records and growth rebounding, Do-yeon, what are some of the structural challenges that still need to be overcome?
Well, the most critical challenge is that a severe K-shaped polarization, largely anchored by the contested real estate market. The administration originally encouraged the stock market surge to act as a pressure valve for housing, the force capital out of non-productive real estate. The government refused to extend the tax deferment period for heavy capital gains taxes on multiple homeowners. However, despite these aggressive demand suppression tactics, actual housing prices have not dropped as significantly as government intended. A meaningful price correction requires a massive increases in housing supply, but severe external factors such as soaring global materials inflation and disrupted supply chains have effectively delayed new residential developments.
To meaningfully lower housing prices, two conditions must be met. First, there must be an expectation that future supply will increase, eliminating the scarcity of homes. Second, there must be an alternative market where people can invest their capital.
So while the administration successfully created that alternative investment market through corporate governance reforms, the physical supply of housing remains artificially constrained by outside forces. Now, all eyes are on the government's second half economic strategy and the upcoming July tax reform, which is widely expected to further increase holding taxes for multiple homeowners to sustain this structural overhaul.
Right. Do-yeon, thank you for that thorough report tonight.
My pleasure.
The Korean won weakened on Thursday, once pushing the $1 exchange rate back above the 1,530 mark. The financial authorities responded on the same day by pledging swift action against excessive volatility. Kim Jun-hong has this report.
The Korean won weakened further against the US dollar on Thursday, with the exchange rate surpassing 1,530 during trading for the first time in more than 2 months. The rate closed at 1,529.71, up 13.31 from the previous session, after opening 13.61 higher at 1,531. The $1 exchange rate has been highly volatile this year amid the Middle East conflict. Thursday's opening marked the weakest start for the Korean won since late March. It was also the first opening above the 1,531 level since the global financial crisis in 2009. Thursday's jump was driven by a mix of external factors, including renewed tensions between the U.S. and Iran and concerns over additional U.S. tariffs. Korea's heavy reliance on imported energy has made it particularly vulnerable to rising oil prices, while a stronger U.S. dollar has added further pressure to the local currency.
The military conflict between the U.S. and Iran boosted demand for safe haven assets. At the same time, soaring natural gas prices in Europe weakened the euro, helping lift the dollar.
Continued foreign outflows from the local stock market has added to the pressure, with investors converting proceeds into dollars before moving funds abroad. Meanwhile, Korea's official foreign reserves declined in May as dollar funds were used to support the foreign exchange market. Reserves stood at $427 billion at the end of the month, down $880 million from April, according to the Bank of Korea on Thursday. The central bank attributed the decline to market stabilization measures, including a swap arrangement with the National Pension Service. As of April, Korea remained the world's 12th largest holder of foreign reserve holdings. Also on Thursday, Finance Minister Koo Yoon-chol stressed the government's readiness to respond to excessive volatility in financial markets. He said the authorities are closely monitoring market conditions as external uncertainties remain high. Kim Jun-hong, Arirang News.
In other news, though the U.S. and Iran have been trading a series of airstrikes over the past week, U.S. President Donald Trump hinted at having no intention of resuming a full-scale war unless U.S. troops are killed. Our Kim Bo-kyung tells us more.
Despite recent hostilities between the U.S. and Iran, President Donald Trump has reportedly insisted on showing that their ceasefire remained intact. According to the Wall Street Journal on Wednesday local time, President Trump has told his aides that he does not intend to resume a full-scale war with Iran unless American military personnel are killed. In fact, he presented the death of U.S. troops as the threshold for terminating the ceasefire, suggesting that he may be willing to tolerate smaller-scale military clashes that fall short of that level. In fact, Trump said on Wednesday that progress in talks with Iran could come within days while talking to reporters at the White House.
I hear the negotiation itself has gone very well, actually. Very well.
Mr. President.
It could happen. I mean, if it happens, and it might not happen, who knows? But if it happens, it could happen like over the weekend.
Trump said that under a deal being discussed with Iran, Washington will get Tehran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium, repeating that the material will be removed from within the Islamic Republic's borders. Meanwhile, Lebanon and Israel have agreed to implement a ceasefire following U.S. facilitated talks in Washington. The U.S. State Department released a joint statement from all three parties on Wednesday.
The ceasefire is contingent on a complete cessation of Hezbollah fire and the evacuation of all Hezbollah operatives from the South Litani sector.
The two sides agreed to swiftly create pilot zones in which the Lebanese armed forces will take exclusive control of the territory to the exclusion of all non-state actors. Haller added that two parties had no hostile intent toward one another and committed to continuing U.S.-brokered negotiations toward a broader security and peace agreement. However, despite the new ceasefire, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said on Wednesday that Israeli forces would not withdraw from Lebanon for the time being and would continue military operations. In a statement, Quds said that the Israeli military would remain stationed in the so-called buffer zone established in southern Lebanon to protect Israeli communities from Hezbollah attacks. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
The South Korean film Colony has surpassed 4 million moviegoers nationwide just 2 weeks after its release. According to the Korean Film Council on Thursday, the film recorded 4,043,755 admissions and is also leading advanced ticket sales. Now, with this milestone, Colony has become the fastest film released this year to hit new records. Directed by Yeon Sang-ho, the zombie thriller stars Chun Ji-hyun and marks the director's latest entry into the zombie genre.
Relief from the early summer heat is on the way. Temperatures will ease back to seasonal norms over the next several days. Seoul will see highs below the 30-degree mark, returning to what's typical for this time of year. Tomorrow, light rain is expected over central regions and the Jeolla-do provinces from the early morning into the morning hours. Most areas will see the rain end by morning, though parts of the inland and mountainous areas of Gangwon-do and northern Chungcheongbuk-do provinces could see showers linger into the later morning hours. Rainfall amount will be light, with less than 5 millimeters expected in the central regions and the Jeolla-do provinces. Tomorrow, Seoul will start the day at 18 degrees Celsius, Chuncheon at 17 degrees, Busan at 19 degrees. Then by the afternoon, Seoul will get up to 27 degrees, Daegu at 29 degrees, Jeju at 23 degrees. We'll hold on to this near normal temperatures for a while longer. Now here's a look at the weather around the world.
That is all we have for tonight. I'm Kim Da-mi. From all of us here at Arirang, thanks for watching and good night.
It feels a bit off. You might even wonder if it was made incorrectly. Let's take a closer look. Its nose is naturally lifted. The ears are laid back, and it roars with its mouth open down to the finely detailed fangs. The beard flows back, and details around the eyes, mouth, tail, and feet are rendered, using the incision technique, bringing the piece vividly to life. On top of the lid, seated at a slight angle, the creature is a lion. In Buddhism, lions are regarded as mystical guardians of truth. And during the Goryeo dynasty, many celadon works were crafted in the form of lions. Though lions are seen as brave and powerful, this one feels endearingly cute, but no less significant. The smoke rising from the burner passes through the holes in the lid and slowly escapes into the air through the lion's mouth. As for the lid, an additional tier was raised on top, carefully placing the lion above it, while the body of the burner is adorned with expansive cloud motifs. What truly makes this incense burner shine is that subtle twist in perspective. Rather than centered, it's set slightly off to one side, gently breaking away from the conventional idea of a perfect symmetry. Small yet confident, off-center yet beautiful. The essence of Goryeo Celadon defying convention. Shall we be drawn into the quiet charm of this piece, whose imperfection creates its own perfection?
Knock knock! The magical door to the world of K-animation is swinging wide open. Meet your instant new BFF, the adorable Catch. Tina Ping will have you hooked from the very first glance. Need a hand? Our Robocar Poli Rescue team is always zooming in to save the day. How about tagging along on Pinkfong and Pal's super exciting quest to reclaim their lost magic? With the mysterious life forms Cabion by your side, you can become a Cabion master and save humanity like the total hero. Protecting children's innocence while igniting their boundless imagination. That's the magic of Korean animation. K-animation, the ultimate bestie for kids worldwide.
Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mo-gyan. Today marks 1 year since President Lee Jae-myung took office, following one of the most turbulent periods in South Korea's modern political history. Over the past 12 months, his administration has focused on restoring democratic institutions after the martial law crisis, while pursuing a pragmatic approach to governance. From appointing figures from both conservative and progressive camps to expanding diplomacy with the U.S., China, and Japan, the government has often sought to move beyond traditional political divisions. While supporters say that it has helped stabilize the political landscape, critics argue that questions remain over polarization, leadership style, and whether economic gains are being felt by ordinary Koreans. So 1 year on, how has Korean democracy changed, and what legacy is the Lee administration beginning to leave behind? For answers to this, we connect to Young-ju Ryu, professor of Korean literature at the University of Michigan. A very big welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And also joining us is Robert Kelly, professor of international relations at Busan National University. Good to see you again, Professor.
Thanks for having me again.
So first, let's start a discussion with Professor Ryu. So President Lee Jae-myung, he took office at a time when Korean society was deeply divided following the martial law crisis and impeachment turmoil. So now, a year later, do you think the Korean democracy has regained a sense of stability and direction?
The short answer would be yes, but a qualified yes, depending on who we have in mind. when we say Korean democracy. The Lee Jae-myung administration, or the South Korean party politics more broadly, the Korean citizenry at large, I think these actors can be discussed separately. About the Lee Jae-myung administration, there's a wide consensus that the report card at the one-year mark is quite good. The administration has moved decisively toward the reform of those elements in the government that had led to the martial law crisis in the first place, such as prosecutorial corruption and overreach. And it's doing that reform agenda with relative stability by focusing on 내란 종식 rather than 적폐청산, as Koreans call that. In other words, rather than calling for the draining of the swamp as a whole, the administration has adopted a more targeted approach toward bringing the insurrectionists to justice. And it's doing that speedily in the first years of the administration rather than dragging it out. But if we fix our eyes on party politics, the answer grows a bit murkier. So a year into the Lee presidency, the People Power Party has shrunk in size, but it has moved further right ideologically. And in a two-party system, when the Conservative Party becomes extreme far-right minority, the ruling party moves rightward as well to snatch up the voters left behind. Without a viable third party on the left to take up the progressive position in a more muscular fashion, the situation can raise some complicated questions for Korean democracy going forward. And finally, on the citizenry question, my answer is also yes. But let me elaborate that a little bit later in this program.
All right, we'll be waiting for that, Professor Liu. But going back to the elections, many overseas Korean scholars back then argued that Korean democracy itself was at stake. And as somebody who publicly supported President Lee at that time, do you feel the past year has moved Korea closer to a democratic recovery that many have been hoping for?
Yes, I was a member of a community of scholars based in the United States who publicly supported Lee Jae-myung in 2022 when he first ran for the presidency. We became even more vocal and more organized after Yoon's martial law declaration in December 2024 and the political sequence that followed. From December 2024 to June 2025, what united us was indeed a very deep concern for Korean democracy under threat. But the dominant emotion we felt at the time and the overwhelming response we got from the non-Koreans around us was one of utter bewilderment. The question constantly was, how could this be happening in South Korea, which is an advanced nation in terms of culture, politics, and economy? And there, how could a sitting president order a military coup, something we wouldn't even expect of a third world developing nation? Then followed a completely peaceful overcoming of that crisis, largely through the power of the informed people and the sophistication and creativity with which the citizens organize themselves. At the University of Michigan, where I teach, I discussed this political sequence with my students. And several of my American students told me afterwards that they wished that they could be Koreans. So the combination of a democracy that has proven to be extremely vulnerable and fragile on the one hand, and extremely potent and dynamic on the other, I think this is a Korean conundrum that scholars like us are still struggling to fully understand. A universalist, a procedural definition of democracy that we might find in a textbook somewhere simply cannot capture and explain South Korea today. So in that sense, I think what we are witnessing is not merely a recovery of democracy that was nearly lost, but the emergence of a new model of democracy at a time when the world, including the United States, is in sore need of inspiration in this regard.
Now, Professor, let's delve deeper into the practices of the Lee administration then. It has been emphasizing what we call open governance, including live broadcasts of cabinet meetings and more direct communication with the public. Do you think these efforts have strengthened democratic transparency and also public trust as well?
As a way of answering that question, let me return to the issue of the citizenry that I bypassed earlier. Here, I'm really reminded of the title of Lee Jae-myung's book, which was published just a couple of months before the presidential election. The title being, in the end, the citizens will get the job done, or in Korean, 결국 국민이 합니다. To my mind, Lee Jae-myung is the least elitist president in all of Korean history, someone who directly identifies with and is of the people. As we all know, Lee Jae-myung's journey to the Blue House was torturous, if not perilous. He was targeted again and again by the prosecution. His career was on the brink of ending numerous times. And at each of these times, the citizens came to his rescue. And that support grew, and that's the support that ultimately put him in the Blue House. And it put him in the Blue House as a servant of the people, not the master. Lee himself refers to himself as mosim in Korean, or servant, and the Korean citizens as the master. The motto for Lee Jae-myung's administration is popular sovereignty, or 국민 주권. And I believe for Lee Jae-myung administration, this is not just lip service, but a matter of deep conviction. So open governance is Lee Jae-myung's way of taking the government directly to the citizens and of reporting what the Muslim has done to the people who deserve to know because they are the masters. That's what 국민주권 means.
Right.
Keeping citizens informed and enlightened keeps also populism at bay.
Right. Let's also bring in Professor Kelly into the conversation. So another defining feature of the Lee administration's first year has been the pragmatic approach, appointing figures from both progressive and conservative camps while pushing policies that cross traditional ideological lines. How much has this reshaped the political image of the administration?
Yeah, I actually think it's helped a great deal. I think the big problem on the Korean right is that it simply is unable to move past Yoon Suk-yeol, right? As was just mentioned, there's still sort of all these candidates out there that sort of are unwilling to accept just how far President Yoon went. And what this has done is has created some space on the center-right in South Korea for the Democratic Party to expand, sort of reach traditional center-right voters who are not going to vote for parties that believe in insurrection or sort of self-coup or whatever we're supposed to call this thing. And I think this is really smart. Right, this is a good way to sort of build a kind of consensual, centrist-oriented government that hopefully can build, I would imagine this is what the president is thinking, that can build some achievements that will actually survive his presidency, particularly if another conservative comes in, right? This has traditionally been sort of a problem in Korea. You get these big sort of left-right swings as the presidency moves from one partisan alignment to another, right? We saw this with Lee Jae-myung, for example, right? He made it really clear that he wanted to sort of like build structures of North Korea that could survive a conservative successor, and they didn't. Right? And so if you're Lee Jae-myung, you can do that this time because the conservatives really, honestly, they kind of disgraced themselves by their inability to move beyond what happened a couple of years ago, right? And that's created room for the Democrats to build a fairly substantial coalition. I mean, it's kind of amazing that they sort of dominate national politics. I mean, that's actually sort of unprecedented, right? I mean, you should see what we call thermostatic public opinion, right? Whereas one party does really well in time, that should lead to a bounce back by the other party. And that's not really happening in Korea. And again, I think that's probably because of this inability to move beyond the Yoon period on the right. And this has given the Lee Jae-myung administration a lot of space to sort of build bridges with pragmatic conservatives and sort of win over center-right voters. So I think this is actually really, really smart, and it's going to probably leave a legacy.
So with a lot of support from the public, the Lee administration has pursued both pro-labor and pro-business policies at the same time, Professor Kelly. So they also emphasize industrial competitiveness and deregulation in some sectors. Do you think this approach is beginning to kind of change Korea's traditional left-right political framework?
My guess is probably not. My own sense, again, is that sort of the Korean right and Korean left are sort of fairly far apart, that there really is sort of sharp polarization in Korea. The president can try to overcome that to a certain extent. And like I said, I think sort of the Korean right's inability to move beyond what happened 2 years ago creates space for an expansion of the center-left coalition, but it's not going to break down the hard right in South Korea, which is a good third of the population. So I actually am kind of skeptical about that. I mean, it's worth trying, right? I mean, why not? But I would actually argue that these things, what you're talking about, deregulation, all that's actually being sort of driven by economic need, right? I think there's a fairly wide consensus that Korea's economy is too controlled, it's too oligarchic, right? And certainly people on the left in Korea think the Gini coefficient is too high. I would actually argue that's not really the case, but I think there's sort of a fair amount of consensus out there, particularly on the left and there in the government, that the economy needs to be more open, right? It needs to be less sort of dominated by a few mega corporations, and so these kinds of arguments work well, and I think the Lee government is going to run with that, again, because it sort of resonates with the sort of centrists, unmoored voting contingency, right, that we just discussed, that they just aren't going to, these sort of unmoored center-right voters are not going to go with the conservatives because of the radicalism on hand in the last year and a half, and this gives Lee some room to sort of run and talk to them or reach out to them a little bit on the labor and economic issues you're talking about.
But when it comes to foreign policy, Professor Kelly, critics have once warned that the Lee administration could take a more anti-U.S. or anti-Japan direction. But over the past year, we've actually seen active diplomacy with Beijing and Washington and Tokyo as well. How would you assess President Lee's pragmatic foreign policy so far?
Yeah, I think it's really worked out well, and I would imagine that there's some veterans in this administration who were around when Moon Jae-in was president, and Moon Jae-in really did run an ideological foreign policy, and it collided pretty severely with South Korean conservatives who started saying in public, he's a Marxist and stuff like that. I think if you're Lee Jae-myung, you're trying to avoid that. You're trying to sort of avoid the sharp polarization that was the case the last time the South Korean left had the presidency. And I think that's why after, as a candidate, when Lee Jae-myung said South Korea should sit out a Taiwan conflict, after that, the Americans sort of snapped back at that really fast, right? The think tank pushback on that was really, really sharp. And after that, Lee Jae-myung never said anything like that. I would imagine that a lot of people in this coalition are thinking that, right? They're sort of uncomfortable with the course of Trumpism in the United States. They're uncomfortable with getting sucked into Taiwan if there's a conflict there. But they're not actually going to talk about it. They're not going to be nearly as vociferous as the Moon administration has been. And I think that's been pretty smart, right? That sort of helped keep the peace with the Americans, right? Donald Trump is wrecking U.S. alliances in the North Atlantic, and that hasn't happened here. I think that's actually a great achievement by the Lee administration. And he's also sort of kept the Chinese from being too unhappy, right? Everybody knows that sort of Korea's caught between the two and sort of being squeezed. And the president, I think, has done a pretty good job maneuvering between those two shoals. Surprisingly well, actually, given that, Donald Trump's president of the United States, he's actually worked out pretty well. There hasn't been an explosion like there has been with the Europeans, so give him credit for that.
Right. We've really been seeing some pragmatic moves on that front. Now, when it comes to the economy, again, the government, it points to achievements like AI investment, stronger exports, and the sharp rise in stock market as well. But critics say many Korean citizens still don't really fully feel these gains in our daily lives. Professor Ryu, how important will that gap between economic indicators and public perception become going forward?
I think it's tremendously important, and I expect the gap to close significantly in Lee's second year. In some ways, the first year of the Lee administration was spent removing the kind of blockages that have traditionally impeded Korean economy from functioning more sensibly and making good on its potential. For example, the so-called Korea discount that had artificially depressed the Korean stock market. The year that we just witnessed it was also one of extraordinary tumult and uncertainty in the world, given the Donald Trump's U.S.-imposed tariffs and the back and forth and all the waffling around tariff policy, as well as the impact of new and ongoing wars. And so I agree that the Lee Jae-myung administration did an excellent job hedging those risks and building up Korea's global standing at a difficult time. Next year, in year two, there's some tailwinds helping the Lee administration, I believe, including his historic tax revenues from the semiconductor industry, I'm expecting macroeconomic indicators to translate into more meaningful dividends that may be felt by everyday citizenry. After all, Lee Jae-myung is at heart a president, I think, who believes in basic income, and that's what his record in Seongnam attests to. So some of the policies that will be felt by the Main Street, I think, will materialize after in the second year, now that the local elections are done.
So ultimately, we'll see how public perceptions may actually matter just as much as the economic data itself moving forward. Now, at the same time, some critics argue that the administration still relies heavily on President Lee's personal leadership style and political instincts as well. Professor Kelly, do you see any risks in this kind of governance?
Yeah, I think he's got a bit of a rock star kind of quality to him, I suppose, right? I'm not sure if he's sort of at Obama levels, but, I mean, there's a bit of that. I think a lot of that is just sort of a reaction to what Yoon Suk-yeol had done, right? Which is sort of drag Korea through the mud for 6 months, right? And so there's a sense that when President Lee came in, that things were new and different, and at least he's committed to democracy and everything. Again, sort of, if you're a center-rightist who's frightened about where the far right in Korea is going, which is sort of like, refusing to admit what Yoon has done. If you're sort of a center-right, center-left kind of voter, you look at Lee Jae-myung and you say, oh my God, thank God, at least he believes in democracy. So I think there's some of that, right? But that will eventually sort of fade, right? In time, presidents make mistakes, they do things people don't like, and opinions polls start to drop. I'm actually rather impressed that President Lee's polling has remained so high. That's actually kind of uncommon. Normally in second and third years, numbers start to go down. That will probably kick in. But of course, this is the reason why Korea has term limits, right? My own sense is that Korea's one-year term limit, term limit of 5 years is actually a really good thing for exactly these purposes, right? You don't actually want sort of cult of personalities in the president's office. And so even if President Lee turns out to have that kind of charismatic authority in the next couple of years, it will eventually fade as the lame duck status kicks in sometime probably in the fourth year.
So finally, when historians actually look back on the first year of the Lee administration, Professor Kelly, what do you think they will see as the most defining impact on Korean politics and democracy as well?
Well, I'm more of a foreign policy guy than I am a domestic policy guy, so let me make the argument that I've made on your show in the past. I'm actually really, really impressed with the way the government has managed Donald Trump, right? That Donald Trump has been just very destructive to U.S. relationships elsewhere, right? In Latin America, in the Middle East, in Europe, right? I mean, Trump wants Ukraine to lose the war. He wants to take Canada, right? He wants to sort of pick a fight with Greenland, with the Danes over Greenland. I mean, there's nothing like that has happened out here, right? And I think the president has really managed that very well. The American reliance relationship is core for South Korean security. It's been that way since the 50s. This is a really, really important thing for Korean elites of every stripe. And the president has managed to avoid a huge explosion in the second Trump term, which a lot of other U.S. allies have not. I kind of wonder what the sort of secret sauce is here, because I bet the Europeans would like to know. But I think when we sort of look back at the carnage that Trump is going to leave of the U.S. alliance system in the West, people are going to say, wow, at least that didn't happen here. I don't know, maybe Trump will come out to East Asia in a year and he'll blow everything up the way he's done elsewhere. But I would argue so far, keeping the geopolitical balance stable, sort of keeping Korea's basic relationships in place without a rupture like you've seen in so many other theaters, that's actually a pretty great achievement. I have a feeling that 5 years later, people are going to look back and say, wow, the Koreans really ducked a bullet while Trump went off and started a war in the Middle East.
Right. So it really does seem like the Lee administration is doing well in terms of balancing its foreign policy as well. So we'll look forward to how the second year of the Lee administration would begin. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Kelly.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, Professor Yu as well. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.